Well, thank you, everybody. It's great to be with you this morning. And Ava, I'll let you cue me if it works or doesn't work. That's fine. We'll just roll with it. So that's great. A little bit more about myself. I am fairly native to Seattle. I say that because I moved here when I was 8 from Hawaii, and so went to Garfield High School, played West Seattle High School numerous times, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but we did pretty well in those days. I'm a graduate of Seattle Pacific, so coming back to your alma mater after decades is always a fun experience, particularly when there's faculty who remember you, so that's always fun too. The work that we do in my research group, Pivot Northwest Research, I want to tell you just a smidgen about it, then we'll get into some slides and what we're going to do this morning together as a congregation. You are going to be the sermon today. You are going to be the people reflecting on what God is doing in your context, in your congregation, and what you hope God is going to be doing with this congregation as we move into the future. As we open God's Word here in a second, and then I get into some data points, this will be a conversation for you in your pews today. There's going to be a big chunk of this where you're going to talk to each other, share dreams, share laments, share questions. I'm going to have John and Larry come on down, and they are going to pass out these are notebooks, little notepads that you're going to get. Now, not everybody gets one. You're going to gather in groups of 4s and 5s in your pews. So do that right now. Kind of turn and say, okay, I think we're going to be a group. Each group is going to get one of these pads. So one per group. And just go ahead and just hand a couple per group and just keep going down. Yep. So, so you can just hand like 2 per view and just keep going, and then they'll do that work for you. So as you are getting your groups together, you're only going to have 1 pad per group. You'll break these up in your groups. So you'll get 1 pad, tear them apart, hand a couple of sheets to each person in your group, so you have a bunch of them from that 1 pad. Okay, groups. So whoever has the pad, start breaking it up for the rest of your group. As I tell my students when I hand out syllabi in class, pass, then read, don't read, then pass, because everybody stops moving the papers around. All right, now as you're doing that, and as we're kind of finishing up getting things out for your groups, and I'll give you your instructions on how to be using these pads in a second, let me tell you a little bit about our background. So you'll see on the slide up here, back in 2016, the Lilly Endowment approached a number of us on a national basis to have a conversation about young adults. And that conversation began with this. U.S. Census data at that time said that the second largest demographic in the United States were 22 to 29-year-olds, right? Baby boomers, then 22 to 29-year-olds. And what they found, though, is that this was the largest group that was coming up through the pipeline as far as a population, but the least likely group to be in a religious institution, a synagogue, a church, a temple, a mosque. So that regression line for a statistician is pretty obvious. Big group, nobody's showing up, okay? So that itself became not $1 million question for Lilly, it became a $55 million question, where they gathered a bunch of research together, those of us who in seminary faculty, those of us who had participating in a lot of work with young adults over the years. They brought us to Indianapolis and they said, basically, help. What's going on? What are churches doing? How are they responding? What's happening? So this began what is now going to be a 10-year study longitudinally across the United States in a myriad of groups. There are researchers like me that are working regionally. So my research team works here in the Pacific Northwest, north to Canada, south to Portland, east all the way over to Idaho. So large Washington State, but Oregon, Idaho, and Washington State. And so we have a lot of churches and groups that we look at in my research group. There are research groups looking at the Roman Catholic Church, Orthodoxy, looking at kind of urbanization, rural areas. So lots of data has been collected over these years. The pads that you have in your hand and with the little quotes that are on there, these are quotes that are taken from church leaders, from young adults, from people who just have questions about young adults. These have all been collected for the past 6 years as we and my research team have sat in church basements, Been in South Lake Union working with Amazon folks with big, huge Yeti coolers filled with drinks, just kind of asking questions about what is God. We have gone to Zumba groups. We have gone to CrossFit gyms. We have been to mountaineering groups. We have gone to places of work. We have spent a lot of time collecting, coding data, having conversations, both quantitatively. We have a lot of study data. I'll put some of that up here, but also qualitative, these conversations and quotes. And I'll get you to the quotes in a second. You can start looking at them as I'm talking, but just know you're going to be using them in just a minute. So this tells you a little bit of the timeline. We've kind of been collecting data for a long time, and now in this phase of it, we are getting out and talking to people like you. What do we do with this stuff? And how do we move this forward? So I want to begin with a quote from a very unusual source before I read the scripture to you, and you can't probably see this here, but I'm going to read it aloud so you can read it. This is from F. Scott Fitzgerald's first novel. Everybody knows The Great Gatsby. If you've taken 10th grade English, you've read The Great Gatsby and written a lot of papers on it. But his first novel, This Side of Paradise, was written right after he graduated from Princeton University. He was trying to figure out his life as America was moving into a time of kind of bootlegging, debauchery, questions of money. His obsession with money was kind of coming to a thing. So in the novel, the main character, Amory Blaine, has gone out into the world. He's graduated from university. He's got a top degree. He's trying to figure out his life, and he makes a lot of mistakes. Loses the love of his life. Gets involved in bootlegging, gets arrested, has all these horrible setbacks, and he's staggering around trying to figure out what to do with his life. And he goes back to Princeton. He goes back to the university he graduated from, and he's standing in the middle of the quad there at Princeton. So imagine for you Huskies going back to Red Square. Imagine for those of you who are Cougars going back to, there's a school over there. No, just kidding. That was a really cheap shot. But I mean, for those of us at Seattle Pacific going to the Loop, you go back to this place that formed you so deeply, and you're trying to figure out what happened to your life, right? So let me read this quote to you aloud. I'm going to kind of walk over here so I can read it off the screen. And so it's midnight. Long after midnight, the towers and spires of Princeton were visible, with here and there the late burning light, and suddenly out of the clear darkness, the sound of bells. An endless dream of it went on, the spirit of the past, brooding over a new generation. The chosen youth from the muddled, unchastened world, still fed romantically on the mistakes and half-forgotten dreams of dead statesmen and poets. Here was a new generation, shouting out old cries, learning old creeds, through a reverie of long days and nights, destined finally to go out into that dirty gray turmoil to follow love and pride. A new generation dedicated more than the last to the fear of poverty and the worship of success. Grown up to find all gods dead, all wars fought, all faiths shaken. And this is Amory Blaine. He turned and shook his fist at the crystalline sky. I know myself, he cried, and that is all. And sorry, I just ruined the end of the book, because that's the last page of the book. But it's a great novel. But a new generation going out into the world, which is kind of your story. What is this generation that you want to have part of the Christian story, who want to know the redemptive power of Jesus, who want to be empowered by the Holy Spirit, who want to be deepened into everything that West Side for generations on this piece of land have given to the Northwest, and given to your lives, to the lives of your family and those you love. What do you do? How do you steward that? When you have a generation who are very obviously afraid of poverty and worship success. And why is that? Because they've been taught that that's the most valuable thing for them to do. In our research, we call this backseat theology. You drop a kid off at youth group, they have a great time at youth group, you go to pick them up, and they hop into the back seat of the car. And you drive away out of the parking lot. And the conversations they're hearing that are happening in the front seat become the theology that they receive. Hey, have you gotten ready for your AP test tomorrow? Hey, have you made, because we got select soccer coming up next week and you got to focus on that. Hey, how are those common apps really coming together? Are you making sure you're ticking the right boxes? Have you really talked about your college essay yet? Do I need to kind of get you signed up for somebody to do that? That theology is about the fear of poverty and the worship of success. And this sinks deep into the bones of a young generation, because the people that are going to form them most are going to be sending them and telegraphing very overtly what's valued, what's going to matter, right? And this last statement, I know myself and that is all, have become the statement that I've heard so many times over 6.5 years of doing this work. This absolute obsession culturally we have to just be known for me, that I'm the most important person in the room. Every marketing thing that I get pushed to me through social media tells me that I am really important to that product, to that institution, and it's all about me. And the heavy, heavy weight on my shoulders, having to bear everything by myself, is exhausting. Absolutely exhausting. So when you talk about anxiety shooting through the roof, mental health questions shooting through the roof, people literally buckling under their knees with all the pressure of being a self in this world, young adults are burdened really heavily right now, and they want a place to go where they don't have to have the weight of everything on their own shoulders. And they do not want to have to fear poverty, and they certainly, frankly, don't want to worship success. It's a flip that we need to talk about a lot in churches. And one of the things I really want you to hear from me on this point too, and this I'll get into this later, young adults we talk to, nationally as well as regionally, do not hate churches. Actually, it's just the opposite. All the data we've looked at as far as on-ramps and off-ramps, most young adults will tell you churches are vitally important to communities. This is where people have food banks. This is where people reach out to communities. These are the few institutions that can turn on a dime in times of national crisis or international situations. Churches have sustained my family. My parents have been formed there. My grandparents love taking me to church. They love churches, but with this caveat. Young adults want good churches, not just churches. And I'll play that out as for what I mean by that in a second. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Charles Murray, who's done a lot of sociological research, and he actually did a lot of work, particularly on white communities, primarily suburban flight communities and whatnot, talked about 4 big sociological shifts that are really kind of hitting us right at this particular moment. He talks about the decline of marriage as a core marker of identity, what it means to actualize and become an adult. I'm no longer a child, now I'm an adult. It doesn't have to be marked by marriage anymore, right? That was one of the big sociological markers for decades, right? That once I got married, therefore I am now fully arrived, right? So that marker has shifted. Second, that there's a change in work ethic. A lot of young adults today, the reality is they're not jumping on a particular train that's going to take them through a career of 30-some years. They may transfer to different organizations, but they're not going to be moving around like that anymore. Gig economy, just trying to get just kind of work as it comes, what's called profile work, where it's basically I have a lot of different skills I'm using for a lot of different things. That has kind of become the norm today for most young adults. A lot of young adults today are always waiting for them to be told that they're redundant, that they're just not needed. Like they'll work for a time, the company says, well, we've run out of funds, and you got to move on to the next thing. So there's a lot of kind of transitory work that's happening, and that constant waiting to see when the next shoe drops, and it's impossible to get forward. This is what we call the everyday earner idea, is that every day is kind of the day that I'm earning. I'm not making forward on these kind of typical building of equity. I'm just trying to get to the next day. Third, the diminishment of institutional law, or what we call respect for it. The idea that institutions in and of themselves are good and have my best intentions for me has moved aside quite rapidly. We've seen this with a lot of the racial unrest, a lot of the questions that we have with various institutions, the questions about police forces, the questions of the military, the questions of big institutions that see themselves as kind of being important are not to be trusted a lot of times. They represent kind of different problems and challenges, and so therefore it becomes challenging when you're talking to young adults about church, because that's an institution. It's an institution that's fraught with a long history of problems and not a long history, for some young adults in particular, of good things. But then if you break up an institution, like West Side, and you say, well, let me tell you about Bryce, let me tell you about John, let me tell you about Larry. And so, well, that's a good person, that's an awesome person, I love that person. So it's not about the institution, it's about getting back to the people in it. That's been a kind of a big move. Fourth is the privatization of religious observance. And this has become a trajectory that's been happening really since the mid-50s, where more and more the idea of my faith is a personal faith, and this is certainly something for Protestants and even more intense for evangelicals, is that my faith is my story. It's my commitment to Jesus. It's my baptism. It's my community. It's my things. And then it becomes a very private thing, right? It's something that I hold, that I curate, that I own. I have this personal faith, so that what it does then is it diminishes the need for having other people in it. right? So now we kind of create what's called a bricolage. We put our faith together with these bits and pieces of other things for myself. I have this podcast, I stream this sermon, I have this book that a friend of mine read, there's a series of things that I do of sort of activism that kind of get the social aspect of it. So it's not part of a kind of a general sense of community, it's very private, right? And for you to ask something about my faith, it becomes challenging, right? So these 4 shifts have become a big marker and a big challenge for a lot of churches as they navigate how to work with young adults today. So what I want you to do right now is I'm going to take a pause on it before I move forward. And I'd like you to get in your groups now, okay? If you don't know each other, I'd like you to introduce yourselves. And if you have now been passed out some of these things, I'd like you to flip through and look at some of these quotes. What is a quote that you got of 1 or 2 pages you've got? How do you respond to what's on that sheet? Just read aloud to each other what you see, and how do you respond to it? If you haven't been passed one, just tear one off. You only need 1 or 2 sheets of paper each. Turn to your neighbor, introduce yourself, take a couple of minutes. I'm going to gather you together, and then we're going to move on in our conversation. How do you respond to the quote that you've been given, one of the quotes you've been given? Go. So I'm going to give you about 1 more minute to wrap up this section. You will get to talk to each other about this just 1 more minute, and I'll bring you back together. 1 minute. So let me go ahead and gather you back together. If you could push pause on where you were, you're going to come right back together. Don't worry about you get to finish that comment. Just hold on to it. I'm going to get you right back to where you were. And there will be more chances to engage some of the other quotes as we go on. This is just to kind of get us thinking a little bit, hearing some voices that are not in this room. I think it's always important for churches to really be thinking through is like who's not in the room right now, and how do we bring that voice into the room? And this is one way to do it, for example. So let me take, Ava, if you could go to the next slide that's up there. I want to talk a little bit about some things that we found in some of our conversations here in the Pacific Northwest in particular. So one study that was done recently on young adults' relationship with God, this is out of a sociological study that was more longitudinal, so it was across a number of different demographics, right? So racially, economically, rural, as well as urban. 4 big movements of kind of how do young adults want to find God in communities really arose to the top. And I want you to think about these 4 terms that I'm going to put at you. Number 1, intimacy. That is that there's some kind of intimacy that a person and God can experience when they come to a place of worship. By intimacy, they mean that it's personal, it's relational, and it's evocative, meaning there's emotion attached to it, right? So it's not merely disembodied, right? It's not something that I merely think about that you wouldn't need me in the room to do, right? So intimacy means there's a relational tie to it. Intimacy comes when I walk into a church like Westside and people remember that I was here talking to you guys before, right? Oh, Jeff, it's good to see you again, right? That you've been known by name, that somebody recognizes you, right? There's a level of intimacy to that. Second, consistency, that there's a way that there's a consistent movement that I'm being asked to participate with over time. One of the ways that our bodies work is that when we do things over and over and over again, our body responds thinking, oh, this must be something this body wants to do. If you want to start running, you get up one morning, you go to the end of the block, you come back and say, boy, I never want to do that again. And then you do it again and again and again, and all of a sudden your body says, fine, I give. Let's start kind of creating some new muscle tissue. Let's create some more VO2 max. Let's create some ways in which your body is now going to live into that, right? That kind of consistency changes. And I would argue theologically, one of the amazing things about being human is you are one of the most malleable things in all of God's creation. You can change. Your body will change based upon what you put into it. Your body will change by what you stop putting into it. Your mind will change when you start thinking and dwelling and reflecting on something over time. When we study Scripture over time, our spirits change. When we gather in fellowship, our hearts change. We change because of consistent efforts to do something intentional. This is why mission and vision is absolutely vital for any church. If we're going to say we're going to go there in 20 years, we have to be consistent there. And young adults who see consistency in an organization, they're committed to something over time, that's really appealing. Third, anxiety. Young adults want churches to take seriously the idea that we don't have everything together, that we have a level of anxiety in life, that sometimes there's something about life that isn't all put together. So let me read to you from Matthew 28, very famous passage that many of you are very familiar with, the Great Commission, where Jesus ends his earthly ministry. He's coming to the end and he's giving this big commission, as we call it, to the disciples to go out into all the world. This is from Matthew 28, beginning at verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them, and when he saw them, they worshipped him, but they doubted. And Jesus said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, and therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. What's powerful about this passage for me is verse 17. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but they doubted. But they doubted. Those who were sent out into the world had some level of anxiety. They weren't sure what was going to happen next. They weren't sure about everything that was going to happen. They had to pay attention to what the Holy Spirit was doing because what they thought was going to happen probably wasn't going to happen. Certainty is not the mark of a church. Faith is. It just is. And faith is always going to give you a little bit of anxiety about how things are going to go. Young adults today have put mental health on the table for us for a very good reason. It's a hard world out there. It is incredibly challenging. When you're a child of divorce, when you're a child of unbelievable economic uncertainty, when you've been racialized to the margins, when you are put into positions of powerlessness in places of work, in places of school, in your background, there's a sense of hardship that needs to go somewhere. And being able to speak about it, share about it, and seek healing about it is something that we as a church should be celebrating. That we have young adults who want to talk about the desire to be made well. It's one of the most profound questions that Jesus asks us. Do you want to be well? And young adults want churches to ask them that question. They want to be on the journey of what that's going to look like. So anxiety, taking it seriously, is vitally important for young adults to feel part of a community. And fourth, and this is the one that's really interesting, anger. What really gets you fired up? What's bothering you about the world? What's disturbing you about the way things are going, right? Is there a level of anger that you can hold in this congregation, in this church, in your community? Young adults who come into spaces where anger isn't allowed, where frustrations aren't allowed, will wonder, well, what's going on here? Do you understand that the world's on fire? Do you understand that Gaza today is unbelievably a hellscape? Do you understand that? And the fact that we do, but don't know how to talk about it, is something that young adults want to step into. Let's find a way to talk about it. Let's talk about what we don't know. Let's talk about sitting in silence and not understanding and being okay about that. I'd like you to turn back in your groups and talk about these 4 words for a minute. And this is going to be hard because it's only going to be about 3 to 4 minutes you're going to get, so I'm going to stop you, just know. But as you think about these 4 words, what are some of the ways that Westside is doing these, and what are some ways you would hope Westside would do some of these things? Go. So I'm going to give you another minute, one more minute to finish up, and then we'll go again. One more minute. Okay, if I could have you come together. See, am I on okay? Okay, great. So let's go ahead and come together. And Ava, see if we go to slide 9, that'd be great. Great, thank you. So what are different strategies that churches have in kind of meeting some of these questions? How does change happen? What are the ways we engage it? Well, these are three kind of images I want you to hold on for your next conversation. Sometimes churches engage what I call a Dumbo's feather mentality. So if you know that Disney cartoon Dumbo, this little elephant who's part of the circus is born with these super big ears, and he gets teased all the time for having, looking different and odd. And these mice tell him, hey, look, here's the thing. If you hold this magic feather in your trunk, you could fly. But you have to hold on to this feather. So he holds on to this feather and flaps his ears, and he's flying around. And he's led to believe that the entire source of everything he needs in life is held in this feather that he has to hold. And if he lets it go, everything falls apart. There are a lot of churches that have Dumbo's feathers as part of their history. Something they believe that there's no possible way they could live without. The moment they set it down, they'll crash to the ground, right? And there's very precious things that a lot of congregations have. And I've been in a lot of churches over the years, and certainly in this study, I've dug deep. And whether it's Presbyterian, Baptist, Foursquare, Charismatic, Roman Catholic, every church has probably a ton of feathers sometimes, but a lot of them have a particular thing. This is our distinctive. This is our history. This is our legacy. I want you to be thinking through what those feathers are for Westside. What is it for you right now that if God was calling you to a new day for the sake of the next generation, what is that feather maybe that's holding on to that's preventing that thing from moving forward? So that's one image. Second, Central Park. Anybody been to New York, been to Central Park, familiar with Central Park? Okay. Throughout the 19th century, there were a number of attempts in urbanization to create beautiful living spaces. When I lived in Glasgow, Kelvin Grove Park is another example. It was built at the exact same time as Central Park was in New York City. These parks were created as urbanization started to grow and sprawl started to happen. People started to move in as a result of the Industrial Revolution, but people were really worried about the debauchery of cities. Right? All the ill-gotten gains that were happening, right? And certainly F. Scott Fitzgerald talks about this a lot in kind of America moving into the 20th century. But the idea was that, look, if we set aside a space for God, and Central Park was an example of that in New York City. It was a pristine area. For years, you could not even have gas lamps inside Central Park. The idea was to keep it like Eden. Beautiful trees growing, beautiful green spaces, literally gates that would close it off and open it up at certain times. And if that's over there, that's okay, then it's okay for us to go to the pool halls over here because we've done our time. We have a place we can go to that's pristine, exactly like God would have wanted it. Now what happens over here stays over here, right? And we keep this nice and pure. This happens over here, and none the twain shall meet. And I tell you, there's a lot of Christians, and I've fallen into this trap myself, where I live that way. I think that it's okay for me to kind of spiritualize my life over here, but that gives me a lot of permission, like carbon purchasing, to do whatever I want over here, right? Central Park. Do you, in some way, shape, or form, possibly have a Central Park idea? That if we just keep this locked down, whatever we need to do to get ahead in culture over here is totally fine, right? And I've seen this happen in churches all the time, where there's a lot of dissonance for young adults where they don't understand. They're like, on one hand, you want me to be this person of success and push and do these other kind of things to get ahead, to get the right things, do all this kind of stuff. Then I come to church, and the other space over here is as if it's some kind of separate walled-off space where those two aren't coming together, right? That can also create tension. And third, singing rocks. Throughout Scripture, it is very evident that God will turn to whoever is singing his praises. That God will move to the places where his praise is being sung and follow and be participating where that goes, even if it's the rocks, right? There's a way in which creation itself groans to be heard by God, that wants to be heard by God. There are hundreds of people today down the street at the farmer's market who in their own way are searching after exactly the praises that you're speaking about right here in this congregation, right? And I will tell you that the Spirit of God is going to move in that farmer's market as much as moving in this congregation, right? Because God is going to go where God is needed, where God is praised, and where God is searched for, right? And so are we open to maybe that what's happening right now in our culture is not happening always here, but also happening there too? And I think we know that intellectually, but it's also a hard teaching. And this is one of the hardest things I'll probably say this morning is this. There will be a number of young adults who will not come to your church. They will not come to any church. That's just something to sit with and to know, right? And no amount of work that we can do may change that. But what we can do is pray for what's happening in the farmer's market. We can pray for what's happening in the congregations around the country that are asking the very same question that you are. It is absolutely okay that you're not everything to everybody. But how do we lift up where something is happening somewhere else, participate in it even from afar, and be okay with that? Be okay with who we are and what God is doing over there as well, right? In different ways that we may not understand. So let's turn back in your groups. Talk a little bit about Dumbrow's feathers. Are there any that you may be holding tightly that maybe you could set down? Are there ways in which we've created possibly a Central Park mentality where we think of this precious space, we're not allowed to kind of interplay with other things that are outside of it? And also, are there places that you're seeing young adults in your life who are growing and flourishing and asking questions of God that may not be here that you could hold on for prayers that we're going to have later? What are places that you know of young adults where they're going and experiencing God that may not be here, but in different ways we should be thinking about how do we support that work over there too? All right, come back together, and we'll give you another 4 to 5 minutes. So I'm going to have you pause for a second and bring you back together. And Ava she's got the slide up now. I'm going to read these words to you, and we'll talk a little bit about the last part of what we're going to do together. What I'd like you to do is take a moment, and you've got your notepads there. You have some space at the bottom to write, or you can flip over a page right on the back. If you want it, if that's an easier way for you to think, or if you just want to mentally do it, that's fine. But if you want to write this out, we can do this. There's a couple of words I want you to think through and for you to kind of pray about and think about, and then we're going to have a little bit of time for you guys to just share in your groups what you kind of heard. Okay, so we're going to be asking you to kind of shout aloud some things here in a minute. First of all, thanks. What are you thankful for what God is doing here at Westside right now? What are some areas that you would celebrate right now as far as who this church is and what God is doing? What are you thankful for? And as you hear kind of our conversation today, what's bubbling to the top for you of thanks? Second, complaint. As we said, young adults really respond well to people who take anger, who take disappointment, take anxiety seriously, the questions. Remember that the people who were sent out into all the world doubted, right? I mean, it's in the Bible. It's right there. These kind of big question askers are the people who built the church, right? So what are the questions you would ask about systems? What are some complaints you have? Or what are some disappointments, maybe, if you want to put it that way, that are kind of coming to mind? Third is petitions. What do we want to bring before God as a congregation? What do you would hope that your session, your leadership, the direction of your church, what would you hope us to move into in the next 5 years, 10 years, as far as that goes? And then promises. What is God doing with us? And we'll kind of do that as part of our offertory at the end. But I really want to focus on thanks, complaint, and petitions here for a second. So take a second in silence. So I'm not going to break into groups yet. I want you to think on your own here. Kind of pray about it, jot some notes down. What are you thankful for what's happening at Westside? As you hear and read some of these quotes, see some of this data about conversation. What are maybe some areas of disappointment, some thoughts that you want to kind of get on the table? And what would you hope your leadership hears as petitions? What are some things you would like to have us gather together as a group? So take a moment, write some of those thoughts down, and then I'm going to have you share some of these thoughts in your groups, and then each group is going to share a couple of words each. We'll give you some chance to do that before we wrap up, before we go to our offertory. Sure. Yeah, assurance is great. Yeah, assurance, yeah. What are some assurances, ways to do it? Yeah, we'll have those together. That sounds great. Yeah. So let's go ahead and break up into our groups now, if you had a chance to think about it, and then we can kind of go. People are chomping at the bit to talk to friends. I want this to happen. So, yeah. Let's take this off mute, people. Let's get together. I'm an external processor too, by the way. So you will have time in a bit to pray together as a group. So know that's coming, to pray about some of the things you're talking about and you've been wrestling with. But I'd like to just briefly ask if there's anybody top of mind, any group, you can raise your hand. And I don't know if you've ever watched movies where somebody's like on a porch and they're on a big thing and they're calling their dog who's 5 acres away. That's the level of voice I want you to use when you share. So what are some areas of thanksgiving? If you want to just pop it up, just a couple of words. If anybody has something to share, you can just pop right up and just say Thanksgiving. Yeah.
I'm really grateful for this church in the children's ministry and the youth ministry. That's kind of what brought us here because you guys are very open and welcoming, and even if we can't come every week or
Right.
Be here all the time, we always go to people who know us and ask about our kids. Oh, is there one more youth group this week?
Yep.
Really appreciate that.
Yep. And I would even add to that, just in what you described, it's not them, it's us, right? You're part of this, right? Yep. And so one of the things we also ask the young adults is, when is their moment of belonging? When do they know that they were a part of it? And what you just shared, you're part of Westside, right? And so that's always good to have a Thanksgiving moment too. Other things you're thankful for? Yeah. Yeah.
So I left for a long period of time, also because of college. And when Lori got brought on, she was like, I'm willing to bring these ugly issues to light because this is a reality. And I'm thankful that because of that, as a community, we've recognized these are issues, they are real, and we want to address them and help out.
That's great. You called a good pastor, and I wasn't paid to say that. Yeah. No, that's great, being within comfortable spaces, right? Questions are so much more interesting than answers. So keep asking questions, right? Okay. What are some other, maybe one or two other things? Or what about petitions or things? Some things you're kind of hopeful for? Okay, up there. Yes.
I appreciate that even with all the changes that we've had over the past few years, the focus of this church is on Jesus. It's
Yeah.
Jesus. What is, Lord, Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're trying to do these things to reach out, but why?
Yeah. For those who didn't hear the word from above, so amidst all the changes that have been happening, just really grateful that you've been centering Jesus, right? That you've kept that person of Jesus in the center of all that you do. And it's just evident. And just your willingness to even have conversations like this, the empowerment that the Holy Spirit has given you to have these things. Jesus is in your midst, right? And that's good news, right? Any other kind of quick comments that we can have? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just very thankful for a multi-generational church that is looking to be more intergenerational.
Yeah.
I'm looking across the pew now.
Yeah.
And I love it. The two services combined as one, and the people that are speaking aren't necessarily from the same services.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you, Lord.
Well, and I tell you, one of the things that we're seeing demographically across the country right now is one of the things that people have said they love over and over about religious communities, right? And this includes outside of Christianity, but religious communities is one of the few places they can have multi-generational relationships, right? A lot of work today has been so truncated around certain age-specific tasks, and then work for home has made it also more isolating in this way. Has a lot of freedom, but it comes at a cost. You come into a room like this and it can actually engage the breadth of what it means to be generational. And just another little factoid to put with that, one of the reasons why we see spikes a lot of times in teen violence, teen suicides, a lot of times it's come back to is they haven't seen a life lived beyond a particular point of crisis. So if you've only lived up to a certain point in history and you're surrounded by everybody you know is 15, it's hard to imagine what that would look like at 26, at 86, right? But to be able to look around a room like this and see this is the arc of what a life can look like, with all its pain, with all its suffering, but I am not just still here, I am joyful in the Lord to be here, right? That speaks volumes of an embodied faith, right? And so multi-generational engagement is one of the best things you can offer a generation, the capacity to be part of the grandness of our life. So I'm so glad you brought that up. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things was mission focus for the interview.
Yep.
maybe different color better, but it's still welcome,
Yeah.
and that the leadership has transparency and willingness to, step out in the soft soil and get dirty a little bit and understand the needs of the congregation.
Yeah. So mission focused, a willingness, I think you said, to be a safe space, right? And a willingness to get out there. And I would even add that I think this conversation is not just safe, but it's also brave. Brave conversations are really important for churches to have, right? That you give me the permission to be in this space, and I know you'll still be in this space. One of the things that I want to end with as we now transition is when young adults move into places of leadership in congregations, one of the hardest things that occurs is a lot of older generation will leave. They will see somebody who's 30, they'll see somebody who's 26, and they're in a place of leadership. And then there's a slow leaving that takes place as people want to find people who are like themselves, maybe telling the stories that they understand, that they remember. And that's part of that's natural, but it signals a very strong statement to young adults about whether or not you want to be here long enough to watch them grow. And my encouragement as you watch transitions in this congregation now over time, stay. Be here. Be present. Listen. Learn from what the next generation wants to share. And they want to hear from you too. It's a two-way street. So be patient. Be available. Be willing to stay in the space with young adults as they grow in their leadership because they do want to hear from you and to be with you as well.